Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into data, and it could be a little overwhelming, right? Especially with all these buzzwords flying around. Anonymized data, synthetic data. It's enough to make your head spin.
It really can feel like you need a whole new dictionary sometimes.
Right. So think of this deep dive as your decoder ring for the world of data. We'll break it all down and help you understand what these different types of data are, how they're used, and why it all matters. Kind of like in cooking, you know?
Oh, I like that.
You wouldn't try to chop an onion with a whisk, would you?
Definitely not. You need the right tools for the job.
Exactly. And just like a well-organized kitchen, data comes in different forms too. We've got structured data, semi-structured data, and then there's unstructured data.
It's a good way to think about it, organizing all those ingredients.
So let's start with structured data. What exactly does that mean? It sounds pretty well-structured.
It is. Think of a spreadsheet. Neat columns and rows, everything in its place. That's structured data, organized and easy to search. Like if you had a database with all your customer information, that would be structured data.
Makes sense. So then where does semi-structured data fit in? Is that like organized chaos?
You could say that. It has some organization, but allows for more flexibility. Like emails, you might have folders, but inside those folders, the content can be all over the place.
So there's some structure, but it's not as rigid. Okay, I think I'm getting it. And then there's unstructured data that sounds a little bit like my desk most days.
I think we can all relate to that. Unstructured data is that mix of everything. Text documents, photos, videos. Super valuable, but it's tricky to analyze because it doesn't fit neatly into a predefined format.
Okay, so we've got our data pantry sorted. Structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. Why is it so important to understand these different types?
Because it determines how we use the data. Just like you wouldn't analyze a spreadsheet and a video in the same way, you need different approaches for different data types. Knowing those differences helps us choose the right tools and strategies to extract the insights we need.
Okay, so that makes sense. But then what about when we're dealing with sensitive information, like, say, medical records? That's when things get really tricky, right?
Absolutely. Balancing the potential benefits of using that data with the absolute need to protect privacy, that's a big challenge.
You can't just ignore things like HIPAA regulations and patient confidentiality. So how do we access and use this valuable data responsibly?
That's where anonymized data comes in. It's a way of removing or altering any personally identifiable information so the data can be used without compromising someone's privacy.
So it's like scrubbing away any identifying details, making the data anonymous.
Exactly. But it's not a simple process. Often you need special tools and expertise to really make sure all that sensitive information is truly removed or masked. And even then, there's still some risk, If someone's really determined, there's always a chance they could re-identify someone.
So anonymization helps, but it's not a foolproof solution. Is there another way to tackle this privacy challenge?
There is, and that's where synthetic data steps in. Imagine creating a kind of dummy data set. It mirrors the statistical properties of the real data, but doesn't contain any actual personal information.
So it's like a realistic simulation of the real data, but completely artificial.
Precisely. Synthetic data can be a powerful tool for protecting privacy while still enabling valuable research and analysis. Let's say you're training an algorithm to diagnose a disease. With synthetic data, you can avoid using real patient records altogether.
That's fascinating. So how is this synthetic data created?
Well, there are a few ways to do it. You can use algorithms to generate data from scratch, or you can use computer simulations to create these realistic but artificial data sets.
So we're essentially building data from the ground up.
In a way, yes. And as these technologies get more advanced, the synthetic data becomes even more sophisticated. It gets harder and harder to tell the difference between synthetic data and the real thing.
Wow, we've gone from organizing our data pantry to like a sci-fi movie.
It is pretty incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
But even though synthetic data is a potential answer to privacy concerns, it's not without its own challenges.
Like what? What are some of the challenges?
Well, one thing is that creating truly representative synthetic data is tough. You need to make sure it accurately reflects the real data without introducing bias. And then, of course, there are ethical considerations as well. We need to make sure that this technology is used responsibly.
Right. We don't want any unintended consequences. This is all really interesting.
It is, and we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore about how synthetic data is being used and how it could impact everything from healthcare to finance.
I'm ready to dive deeper. What's next?
Let's look at some specific examples of how synthetic data is already making a difference in the real world.
So we've got a handle on the different types of data now, and it's clear that understanding those differences is really important for working with data effectively. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of using sensitive data, especially when it comes to things like medical records and protecting people's privacy.
Absolutely. That's where anonymized data and synthetic data come into play. They're like tools for balancing the need for data access with the crucial need to protect sensitive information.
Right. Let's take a closer look at those. We touched on them briefly earlier, but I'd love to understand how they actually work.
Sure. Let's start with anonymized data. Basically, it's about removing or altering any personally identifiable information from a data set. It's like hitting the delete key on anything that could link the data back to a specific person.
So it's like giving the data a disguise so no one knows who it belongs to.
Exactly. That's super important in fields like healthcare, where patient confidentiality is a top priority. Imagine you're a researcher studying a new treatment for a disease. You need access to patient data to understand the disease and see how well the treatment is working, but you can't just go around sharing people's private medical information.
That makes sense. Anonymized data lets researchers analyze trends and patterns without knowing who the individuals are.
Exactly. But anonymization can be pretty tricky. You often need special tools and people with expertise to make sure all that sensitive information is really removed or masked. And even then, there's still a little bit of risk. It's not impossible for someone to potentially re-identify individuals if they're really determined and have enough external information.
So it's a step in the right direction, but not a perfect solution. Which brings us to synthetic data, right?
Right. Synthetic data offers an even stronger approach to privacy protection. Instead of trying to hide the identities in real data, we create entirely new artificial data sets that behave just like the real data statistically, but without any actual personal information.
So it's like building a simulation of the real data, but without any of the risks.
You got it. It's kind of like creating a virtual world that mirrors the patterns and relationships we see in the real world, but with totally made-up individuals and events.
That's wild. What are some of the ways people are actually using synthetic data today?
One really cool application is in medical research. Imagine training a computer program to diagnose diseases without ever needing to look at real patient records. With synthetic data, you can create this massive data set of virtual patients who show the same symptoms and disease patterns as real people, but without any real personal information attached.
That's amazing. It could completely change how we approach healthcare. Researchers could develop new treatments and diagnostic tools without ever putting anyone's privacy at risk.
Absolutely. And the applications go way beyond healthcare. For instance, banks are using synthetic data to train their fraud detection systems. By creating synthetic data sets that mimic real transactions, they can teach their algorithms to spot fraudulent activity more effectively without exposing any real customer data.
So they can fight financial crime while protecting people's sensitive financial data. It's like a win-win. Where else are we seeing synthetic data being used?
Oh, the possibilities are huge, and they're growing all the time. Self-driving car companies, for example, are using synthetic data to train their vehicles in virtual environments. That way, they can safely test and improve their algorithms in all kinds of simulated scenarios, like busy city streets or slippery mountain roads, without actually putting anyone in danger.
That's really smart. It's like giving those self-driving cars a virtual driver's ed course before they hit the real road. What about other fields?
Definitely. Synthetic data is being used in robotics to help train robots to do complicated tasks safely and in controlled settings. And in retail, companies are using it to streamline their supply chains, forecast customer demand, and tailor shopping experiences to individuals.
Wow, it sounds like synthetic data is popping up everywhere.
Yeah.
But with all this potential, are there any downsides, any limitations?
You're right. It's not all sunshine and roses. Building high-quality synthetic data that truly revests the complexity of the real world is still a challenge. We have to make sure it accurately captures all the little details and variations of the original data, but without creating any biases or inaccuracies.
I see. If the synthetic data doesn't match up with reality, it could lead to mistakes or even do harm.
Exactly. Plus, there are ethical questions to consider, too. We need to be careful that synthetic data doesn't reinforce existing societal biases. If the computer programs that generate this data are trained on biased data, it could make those biases even worse in the synthetic data sets, potentially leading to unfair or discriminatory outcomes.
That's a really important point. It sounds like we need to be really thoughtful about how we develop and use synthetic data.
Absolutely. It's a powerful technology, so we need to make sure it's being used ethically and for the benefit of everyone.
So we've talked about anonymized data and synthetic data as ways to handle the challenges of working with sensitive information. But as we move further into this data-driven world, what new questions and challenges might pop up? What might the future of data look like?
That's a fantastic question, and it's a perfect segue to the next part of our discussion.
So we've been talking about anonymized data and synthetic data as potential solutions for protecting privacy. But as we move further into this data-driven world, are there, I don't know, new questions and challenges that might come up? What might the future of data look like?
That's a great question to be thinking about. One thing's for sure, data is only going to become more and more important in our lives. As we create more data, the possibilities for insights and innovations just explode.
But with that potential comes a responsibility to use data ethically, right? Especially with the lines between real and synthetic data blurring.
Absolutely. And as synthetic data gets more sophisticated and harder to tell apart from the real thing, it raises some interesting questions about trust and authenticity. Like, how do we even know what's real anymore? And who's making sure synthetic data is being used accurately and ethically?
It's like we're entering this whole new era of information where we need a new set of skills for evaluating the data we see.
Exactly. We need to become much more careful about the information we consume, developing a healthy sense of skepticism, and learning to question where data comes from, especially as synthetic data becomes more common.
So media literacy is going to be even more important moving forward.
Absolutely. And it's not just about individual responsibility either. We need a broader conversation as a society about the ethical implications of synthetic data, and we need to develop some guidelines and regulations to make sure it's used responsibly.
It's a shared responsibility to ensure this powerful technology is used for good. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. The world of data is complex, and it's always changing, but by understanding the different types of data, the challenges they present, and the potential solutions, we can navigate this landscape more confidently and ethically.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning, everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of data.
Until next time.